The house had learned how to be quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles after a long day, but a careful silence, one built over years of routine, restraint, and unspoken understanding. Every sound mattered here. Every footstep, every closing door, every breath taken too loudly could unsettle the fragile balance they lived inside. Margaret noticed these things because she had trained herself to. Long before the doctors gave names to her daughter's limitations, Margaret had already learned how to listen differently. She could hear anxiety in the scrape of a chair, confusion in the pause between words, distress in the way the television volume crept higher when her daughter was overwhelmed. Emily sat at the kitchen table now, folding and unfolding a napkin between her fingers. 22 years old, but the world met her gently or not at all. Her dark hair fell across her face as she hummed softly, a tune Margaret didn't recognize. Emily hummed when she was nervous, when her thoughts tangled faster than she could explain them. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, keeping her voice light, "we'll be late if you don't put your shoes on." Emily nodded, though she didn't move right away. She stared at the napkin as if it held instructions only she could read. After a moment, she stood and padded toward the hallway, her steps uneven but familiar. Margaret watched until she disappeared, then exhaled slowly. Mornings were always like this, measured, repetitive, safe. Margaret liked them that way. The world outside the house was unpredictable, full of stares that lingered too long and questions that felt sharp even when they were wrapped in politeness. Inside these walls, Margaret could control things. Inside, Emily was protected. At least, that's what Margaret told herself. The appointment had been scheduled weeks ago, routine on paper. Emily had complained of stomach pain, vague and inconsistent. Margaret assumed it was anxiety or diet or one of the many small ailments that came and went without warning. Still, she never ignored symptoms. She couldn't afford to. The drive to the clinic passed mostly in silence. Emily watched the trees blur past the window, her reflection flickering in the glass. Margaret's hands tightened around the steering wheel as traffic slowed. She glanced over, searching her daughter's face for discomfort. "Does it still hurt?" Margaret asked. Emily hesitated. "Sometimes," she said softly. "It's heavy." Margaret frowned. "Heavy how?" Emily shrugged, her shoulders lifting unevenly. "Just heavy." Margaret didn't press. Pressing often made Emily retreat further, into a place where words became too big to carry. Instead, Margaret nodded and returned her eyes to the road, a small knot forming low in her stomach. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. Emily sat close to her mother in the waiting room, their knees almost touching. Margaret filled out forms she completed 100 times before, answering questions about medications, diagnoses, emergency contacts. Each box felt like a reminder of how much responsibility rested on her shoulders. When the nurse finally called Emily's name, Margaret stood immediately. She always did. She followed Emily into every room, answered every question the doctors directed too quickly or too vaguely. She had learned that if she didn't speak, no one would truly hear her daughter. Inside the examination room, Emily perched on the paper-covered table, feet swinging slightly. The doctor smiled, kind but brisk, and asked the usual questions. Emily responded with nods and short phrases, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then came a pause. The doctor glanced at the chart again, then back at Margaret. "We're going to run a few tests," she said carefully, "just to rule some things out." Margaret nodded, though unease crept up her spine. The tone was different, slower, more deliberate. As the doctor stepped out, Emily's humming returned, louder this time. Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand, feeling how cold it was. "It's okay," she said, more to herself than Emily. But the silence that followed felt heavier than any they had known before, thick, waiting, charged with something unnamed. And somewhere beneath that silence, a truth was already pressing forward, ready to shatter everything Margaret believed she had kept safe. The silence didn't break when the doctor returned. It thickened. Margaret noticed it immediately. The way the woman's expression had changed, the careful neutrality pulled tight across her face. She held a clipboard closer to her chest now, as if the papers themselves needed protecting. Margaret stood instinctively, her chair scraping against the floor. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The doctor closed the door behind her before answering. "Please sit," she said gently. Emily's humming stopped. Margaret didn't sit right away. Her pulse began to thud in her ears, loud enough to drown out the faint beeping of a machine in the corner. She had sat through bad news before, diagnoses, reassessments, revisions of expectations, but this felt different. This felt careful. The doctor cleared her throat. "We ran a routine blood panel," she began. "Given Emily's symptoms, we also included a pregnancy test." Margaret let out a small, startled laugh before she could stop herself. "That's not possible," she said quickly. "She can't be." The doctor didn't smile back. Margaret felt the room tilt, just slightly. "There must be a mistake," she continued, words tumbling over one another. "Emily is always with me. She doesn't go anywhere alone. She doesn't." Her voice faltered. "She doesn't have a boyfriend." Emily's hands clenched in her lap. She stared at the wall, her eyes unfocused, as if she were trying to disappear into the pale paint. "I understand this is shocking," the doctor said, her voice calm but firm. "But the results are very clear. Emily is pregnant, approximately 12 weeks. The number echoed, meaningless at first. 12 weeks. 3 months. An entire season had passed without Margaret noticing anything more than stomach pain and fatigue. An entire season where something had been happening right under her watch. "No," Margaret whispered. "No, that can't be right." The doctor shifted her weight. "Has Emily had any unsupervised contact with anyone? A caregiver? A therapist? Anyone at a program or facility?" Each question landed like a blow. Margaret shook her head automatically. "I'm always there. I make sure of it. I've made sure of it her whole life." The doctor looked between them, then lowered herself into a chair, so she was eye level with Emily. "Emily," she said softly, "can you tell me who the baby's father is?" Emily's breathing quickened. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head. Her fingers twisted the fabric of her shirt until it bunched and wrinkled. "It's okay," Margaret said quickly, dropping to her knees in front of her daughter. "You can tell me. You're not in trouble. I just need to understand." Emily's eyes flicked to her mother's face, then away again. I don't know," she murmured. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. The doctor straightened, her expression now tinged with concern that bordered on alarm. "Margaret," she said carefully, "given Emily's disability, the situation raises serious safeguarding issues." Safeguarding. The word sounded clinical, distant, but its meaning was unmistakable. "You're saying someone hurt her," Margaret said, her voice flat. "I'm saying we need to consider the possibility," the doctor replied. Margaret's thoughts raced, grasping for explanations that didn't exist. She replayed every day, every routine, every moment Emily had been out of her direct sight, even briefly. Grocery store aisles, waiting rooms, therapy sessions where Margaret had stepped outside for a phone call. The gaps were suddenly enormous. Emily began to rock slightly, her eyes glassy with fear. Margaret wrapped her arms around her, pulling her close, feeling how small she felt in that moment. The weight of the diagnosis pressed down on Margaret's shoulders, heavier than any responsibility she had ever carried. Pregnant, not just a medical condition, a consequence, a violation. As they left the clinic, pamphlets and instructions clutched uselessly in Margaret's hand. One question echoed louder than all the others. How could this have happened without me knowing? And somewhere ahead, waiting in the unanswered spaces of Emily's silence, was a truth that would demand to be seen, whether Margaret was ready for it or not. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Margaret barely remembered the turns she took, only the tight grip of her hands on the steering wheel and the way Emily sat unusually still in the passenger seat. The pamphlets from the clinic lay crumpled on the floor, their glossy reassurance mocking her with phrases like support and options. None of it answered the only question that mattered. At home, the silence returned, but it was no longer familiar. It pressed in from every corner, thick with things unsaid. Emily went straight to her room without being asked, closing the door gently behind her. Margaret stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the faded wood, listening for movement. Nothing. She made tea she didn't drink. The kettle screamed, startling her, and she flinched harder than she expected. Her thoughts ran in circles, replaying the doctor's words, Emily's blank stare, the way her daughter had said, "I don't know," as if the answer truly didn't exist. Margaret knocked softly on Emily's door. "Sweetheart." A pause. Then, "Okay." Emily sat on the edge of her bed, knees pulled to her chest. She was rocking slightly, the mattress creaking in a steady rhythm. Margaret sat beside her, careful not to crowd her space. "Emily," she said gently, "I need you to help me understand something." Emily nodded, eyes fixed on her hands. "Do you remember being with someone?" Margaret asked. "Anyone touching you in a way that made you uncomfortable?" Emily's rocking slowed, her brow furrowed as if she were searching through fog. "I think," she said slowly, "he was nice." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Who was nice?" Emily shrugged. "He talked quiet, said I was good." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Where did you see him?" Emily hesitated. "Sometimes different places." She squeezed her eyes shut, frustrated. "It's fuzzy." Margaret fought the urge to fill the silence, to suggest names, faces, possibilities. She knew better. Leading questions could fracture the fragile truth forming in Emily's mind. "Did he ever tell you not to tell me?" Margaret asked softly. Emily nodded once, said it was our secret. The word secret landed heavily between them. Margaret reached for Emily's hand, holding it firmly. "Did he hurt you?" Emily's lips trembled. "He said it wasn't hurting. Said it was love." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she forced herself to stay still, present. Emily needed steadiness now more than ever. "Emily," she said, her voice breaking despite herself, "you can tell me anything. You didn't do anything wrong." Emily looked up then, her eyes wide and wet. "You'll be mad," she whispered. "No," Margaret said immediately. "Never at you. Never." Emily's shoulders slumped, relief and fear mixing in her expression. "I don't remember his face good," she admitted. "Sometimes I forget. Sometimes I don't know if it was real." Margaret pulled her into a careful embrace, holding her as Emily's body shook with quiet sobs. The fragments were there, kind words, secrecy, confusion, but no clear picture, no name she could grasp. Later, after Emily finally fell asleep, Margaret sat alone in the living room, the house dark around her. She replayed Emily's words again and again, searching for meaning in the gaps. He talked quiet, different places, a secret. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the hallway, to the closed door of Emily's room. Beyond it were notebooks, drawings, old toys, and the computer Emily spent hours on, clicking through games and videos Margaret never fully understood. A thought stirred, uneasy and persistent. Emily couldn't say what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, something else could. Margaret stood slowly, her heart pounding, and walked toward a faint glow beneath Emily's door, unaware that what she was about to uncover would change everything she thought she knew. Margaret stood outside Emily's bedroom door longer than she meant to. The house was dark now, save for a thin strip of light leaking from beneath the door. Emily had always slept with the computer on, its soft glow a comfort against the shadows. Margaret used to scold her for it, worrying about sleep cycles, screen time, headaches, but tonight that glow felt like an invitation, or a warning. She knocked once, softly. No answer. Margaret eased the door open. Emily lay curled on her side, breathing slow and even, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. The computer sat open on the desk, screen dim but still awake, as if it had been waiting. Margaret hesitated. This felt like crossing a line. Emily's computer was one of the few things that truly belonged to her, her private world of games, music, and routines that made sense to her even when nothing else did. Margaret had promised herself she wouldn't pry, but promises felt smaller now, fragile, overshadowed by words like secret and love, and I don't remember his face. She stepped inside and gently pulled the door closed behind her. The chair creaked as she sat. The screen brightened at the touch of the mouse, revealing the familiar login page. Margaret frowned. She didn't remember Emily ever locking it before. "What are you hiding, sweetheart?" she whispered, immediately hating herself for the question. She tried the password she knew, the one Emily had used for years, a simple combination Margaret had helped her choose. The screen flashed red. Incorrect. Margaret's pulse quickened. She tried again, slower this time. Still wrong. A chill crept up her arms. Emily didn't change routines easily. For her to change something like this meant intent. Privacy. Secrecy. Margaret leaned back, thinking. Then she typed Emily's favorite word, the one she wrote again and again in her notebooks when she was anxious. The screen unlocked. Margaret exhaled shakily. The desktop looked ordinary at first. Bright icons, cheerful colors, a mess of folders with half-finished names. But something felt off. New icons she didn't recognize. A browser window minimized, not closed. She clicked it open. Her breath caught. Dozens of tabs filled the screen. Searches layered over one another like frantic thoughts frozen in time. Can you get pregnant if you don't understand? Is it bad if you like someone older? What if it hurts but they say it's love? Margaret's hands began to shake as she scrolled. Her eyes burned, but she didn't stop. She opened the messages next. A chat window appeared, the username unfamiliar. The tone of the messages was gentle, reassuring. Carefully chosen words wrapped in praise and encouragement. You're special. You're mature for your age. Your mom wouldn't understand. This is just between us. Margaret felt sick. The time-stamp stretched back months. The conversations followed a pattern she couldn't unsee now. Compliments first, then secrecy, then subtle pressure disguised as affection. Emily's replies were shorter, uncertain, full of questions that went unanswered or were redirected. One message made Margaret's vision blur. Don't worry. You didn't do anything wrong. Margaret pushed back from the desk, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Margaret froze until she settled again. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't an accident. This was grooming. Margaret wiped her face with trembling hands and leaned forward again, forcing herself to keep going. She opened a folder hidden inside another folder, its name intentionally bland. Inside were audio clips, short recordings muffled and incomplete. Margaret didn't press play. Not yet. She wasn't sure she could survive hearing his voice. What she could see was enough. Someone had found the cracks in Emily's understanding and widened them slowly, patiently. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Margaret closed the laptop gently, as if it might explode beneath her touch. Her heart hammered painfully in her chest, each beat echoing one undeniable truth. This person wasn't a stranger. They had time, access, opportunity. And as Margaret stood in the dark, staring at her sleeping daughter, she realized the next question wasn't what happened. It was who had been close enough to make it happen. Margaret didn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, words from the screen rearranged themselves behind her eyelids. Special, secret. Your mom wouldn't understand. They echoed with a voice she couldn't yet place, but felt she should recognize. By morning, her exhaustion had sharpened into something colder and more dangerous. Focus. Emily woke late, confused by the heaviness in the house. Margaret moved through breakfast on instinct, smiling when she was supposed to, answering questions with practiced calm. She couldn't afford to frighten her daughter. Not yet. Whatever came next had to be careful. Controlled. When Emily retreated to the living room with her tablet, Margaret stepped outside for the first time since the night before. The air felt unreal, too bright, as if the world hadn't gotten the memo that everything had changed. Her phone buzzed. Margaret flinched before she even looked at it. The name on the screen was familiar, comforting once. Someone she'd trusted enough not to question. Margaret. The voice said when she answered, I heard from the clinic. Emily didn't come in today. Is everything all right? Margaret closed her eyes. It was subtle. How the voice carried concern without urgency. Curiosity without intrusion. She'd heard it dozens of times before in hallways and offices, wrapped in professionalism and reassurance. A voice from outside her home, from the system she relied on to help Emily function in a world that wasn't built for her. We had an appointment yesterday, Margaret said carefully. Things came up. A pause. Just a fraction too long. I see, the voice replied. Is Emily okay? Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. She will be. Another pause. If there's anything you need, support, resources. We're managing. Margaret cut in, sharper than she intended. Silence stretched between them. Then the voice softened. Of course. You know where to find me. The call ended, but Margaret stood frozen long after the screen went dark. That voice. She'd heard it before, filtered through headphones, low and deliberate, exactly the kind of tone that made Emily feel safe. Margaret's stomach churned as memory after memory surfaced, rearranging themselves into something ugly. The private sessions. The insistence that Emily needed independence. The moments Margaret had stepped out to give her daughter space. The reassurances. She's doing great. You're such a devoted mother. Margaret leaned against the porch railing, bile rising in her throat. Inside, Emily laughed suddenly at something on her tablet. The sound pierced Margaret like a blade. How many times had she heard that same laugh after sessions she hadn't questioned? She went back inside and sat across from Emily, studying her face with new eyes. Emily, she said gently, do you remember talking to someone on your computer, someone you also knew in real life? Emily's smile faded. She shrugged. Sometimes. Did he talk like this? Margaret asked, lowering her voice, mimicking the calm, careful cadence she now recognized. Emily stiffened. Her eyes flicked up. How you know that voice? Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. I just want to understand, she said, keeping her tone steady. Did that person ever tell you they were helping you? Emily nodded slowly. He said he knew me, said I was safe with him. Safe. Margaret swallowed hard. Did he ever say not to tell me things? Emily looked down, said you'd worry too much. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as realization solidified into certainty. This wasn't a stranger lurking online. This was someone embedded in their lives. Someone with credentials, authority, and the power to blur lines under the guise of care. Margaret stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. Rage bubbled beneath her fear, hot and disorienting. She had opened her door to this person, invited them in, thanked them. That night, after Emily was asleep, Margaret returned to the computer. This time, she didn't hesitate. She searched for names, cross-referencing schedules, messages, timestamps. Patterns began to emerge. Appointments matched messages. Days Margaret remembered stepping out of line perfectly with gaps in supervision. The voice from outside was no longer abstract. It was leaving fingerprints everywhere. And as Margaret stared at the evidence taking shape, one terrifying truth became clear. This wasn't a single betrayal. It was a pattern, and she was only just beginning to see how deep it went. Margaret stopped thinking in days and nights. Time blurred into a single, relentless search. She sat at the dining table with Emily's laptop open, the house lit only by a single lamp. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in a steady rhythm that matched her pulse. She moved through files slowly now, deliberately, no longer reacting, only observing. That was the only way to survive what she was seeing. Patterns revealed themselves when emotion stepped aside. Messages clustered around certain days. Always the same. Appointments marked on a calendar, followed by reassuring texts that arrived within hours. You did great today. I'm proud of you. You're getting better so fast. Margaret opened her own planner and laid it beside the computer. The alignment was unmistakable. Days she'd stepped out to make phone calls. Days she'd trusted too easily. Days she'd been grateful for help. Her chest tightened as guilt wrapped around her ribs like wire. She scrolled further back, noticing subtle changes in Emily's language over time. Early messages were hesitant, uncertain, full of questions. Later ones echoed phrases that weren't Emily's at all. Words too smooth, too practiced. Someone else's vocabulary stitched into her daughter's thoughts. This wasn't spontaneous. It was coached. Margaret rubbed her temples, fighting a wave of nausea. She remembered moments she dismissed. Emily flinching at touch, sudden mood swings, her fixation on privacy, signs she'd explain away as anxiety or growing independence. Independence. The word made Margaret's stomach turn. She played one of the audio files, keeping the volume barely above a whisper. The recording was distorted, muffled by fabric or distance, but the voice cut through clearly enough, calm, patient, intimate in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "You're doing exactly what you're supposed to," the voice said. "This is how people who care show it." Margaret slammed the laptop shut, her hands trembling violently. She pressed her palms to the table and leaned forward, breathing hard. The house felt contaminated, every room touched by something invisible and malignant. From the hallway, Emily watched silently. Margaret hadn't heard her approach. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," Emily said suddenly, her voice small. "I messed up." Margaret crossed the room in 3 steps and knelt in front of her. "No," she said fiercely. "You didn't. None of this is your fault." Emily's face crumpled. "He said I'd ruin everything if I told." Margaret closed her eyes, holding Emily close as her daughter shook with sobs. The manipulation was complete. Fear woven into affection, obedience framed as love. Later, after Emily was asleep again, Margaret wrote everything down. Dates, times, phrases that repeated. The careful escalation from kindness to control. It read like a blueprint. She realized then that this wasn't just about one person abusing power. It was about how easily that power had gone unquestioned. Margaret opened her email and drafted a message she wasn't ready to send yet. She needed more than suspicion, more than instinct. She needed proof strong enough to withstand denial, bureaucracy, excuses. As dawn crept through the curtains, Margaret stared at the screen, her reflection faint and hollow-eyed. She understood now. What had happened to Emily wasn't an isolated act. It was a result of a system that allowed intimacy to masquerade as care. And to break it, Margaret would have to expose not just a person, but the illusion that had protected him. Margaret thought she understood manipulation. She had lived a life built on vigilance. Doctors, specialists, caseworkers, each one carrying opinions about what Emily could or could not do. She had learned to filter advice, to protect her daughter from cruelty disguised as expertise. But what she was seeing now was something far more insidious. This wasn't force. This wasn't threat. This was affection sharpened into a blade. She reopened the messages, this time reading them not as a grieving mother, but as an unwilling witness to a slow psychological dismantling. Each exchange followed a rhythm that made her stomach twist. Praise came first, then reassurance, then isolation. "You're the only one who understands me like this. Your mom worries too much. She doesn't see how grown you are. What we have is special. Other people wouldn't get it." Margaret could almost hear how gently those words would have been spoken, how they would have settled into Emily's mind, filling spaces where doubt and longing already lived. Emily had always wanted to be capable, to be trusted, to be loved without supervision. The messages promised her all 3. Margaret scrolled further, her breath shallow. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Compliments turned conditional. Warmth came with expectations. Silence followed hesitation. "Don't pull away. I thought you cared. This is how people show love." Margaret felt rage burn behind her eyes, hot and blinding. Love was never supposed to feel like pressure, or confusion, or fear. She found a longer audio recording buried among the files. Her finger hovered over play button for a long time before she pressed it. The voice was calm, almost tender. "I know this is new for you," it said, "but you trust me, right? I would never do anything to hurt you." Margaret shut her eyes, her nails digging into her palms. The words were textbook reassurance, delivered with practiced sincerity, the kind that made resistance feel unreasonable, even cruel. When the recording ended, the room felt unbearably still. Emily sat across from her on the couch, knees tucked to her chest. She had been watching Margaret carefully, as if reading her reactions for permission to feel something. "Emily," Margaret said quietly, "when he talked to you like that, how did it make you feel?" Emily frowned, searching for the answer. "Safe," she said at first. Then her voice wavered, but also scared when he was quiet. Margaret nodded. "Did you feel like you owed him?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "He said he helped me, that I should help him back." Margaret's chest tightened painfully. "That wasn't love," she said gently but firmly. That was control. Emily's lip trembled. But he was nice. I know, Margaret replied, pulling her close. That's how he made it work. They sat together for a long time, the weight of that realization settling between them. Margaret felt grief for the innocence Emily had lost. Not in a single moment, but piece by piece, each time affection was used to bend her will. That night, Margaret wrote again. Not just dates and patterns now, but language, the exact phrases, the emotional hooks. She researched terms she had only heard in passing before. Grooming, coercive control, power imbalance. Each definition fit too perfectly. This wasn't an accident of misunderstanding. It was a strategy. Margaret saved everything to an external drive, labeling files carefully, methodically. Her fear was still there, humming beneath the surface, but was being replaced by something steadier. Resolve. She looked down the hallway toward Emily's room, listening to the soft sounds of sleep. The truth was out now, at least between them. But truth carried a cost, and Margaret knew paying it would mean inviting strangers into their pain. Still, she also knew this couldn't remain hidden, because when love is turned into a weapon, silence becomes its accomplice. And the next step, no matter how frightening, would be to break that silence wide open. The morning Margaret made the call, her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She waited until Emily was settled in the living room, wrapped in a blanket and watching the same familiar program she'd seen 100 times before. Routine still mattered. Stability still mattered. Margaret stepped into the kitchen, closed the door, and stared at the wall as the line rang. When a voice finally answered, official, measured, Margaret felt the last remnants of denial drain from her body. I need to report something, she said. It involves my daughter. The words that followed came out haltingly at first, then faster, as if once released they refused to be contained. Pregnancy, disability, messages, audio files, a trusted professional. Silence stretched on the other end, broken only by careful clarifying questions. Margaret gave names, dates, evidence. When the call ended, she sank into a chair, her legs weak beneath her. She had crossed a threshold she could never return from. The illusion of safety, of oversight, of protection through proximity was broken. 2 days later, they sat in a small interview room that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Emily perched beside Margaret, hands clenched tightly in her sleeves. A woman across the table spoke softly, introducing herself, explaining her role. Another figure sat slightly behind, quiet, watchful, taking notes. We're just here to talk, the woman said gently. Emily, you're not in trouble. Emily nodded, but her eyes darted to Margaret for reassurance. The questions came slowly, rephrased again and again. Emily tried to answer, her words tangling, slipping away from her when pressure mounted. Sometimes she went quiet altogether, her gaze fixed on the table, as if the wood grain held the answers. Margaret watched helplessly as confusion was mistaken for inconsistency. Do you remember when this happened? I think. Are you sure? I don't know. Each I don't know felt like a small failure, even though Margaret knew it wasn't. Trauma didn't live on a neat timeline. It blurred, fragmented, hid. At one point, Emily covered her ears. Too many questions, she whispered. The interview paused after that. Outside, in the hallway, Margaret pressed her back against the wall, fighting the urge to scream. She understood now why so many people stayed silent. The process itself felt like another test Emily was destined to fail. Over the next weeks, the house filled with paperwork and waiting. Investigators reviewed files. Specialists weighed in. Meetings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Margaret learned a new language, one built from acronyms and procedures, from phrases like burden of proof and credible testimony. Not everyone believed immediately. Some questioned interpretations. Others focused on Emily's limitations, her memory gaps, her suggestibility. Margaret felt fury ignite every time doubt crept into the conversation. He knew exactly what he was doing, she said again and again. He knew she trusted him. But belief moved slowly, cautiously. Meanwhile, Emily withdrew. She slept more, spoke less. Sometimes she asked if she was bad, if she caused trouble. Margaret held her tightly and answered the same way every time. No, you told the truth. Late one night, Margaret received a call. Short, careful. The investigation would continue. She was told, but there would be challenges. The case wouldn't be simple. The person they'd named had a reputation, a record of trust. Margaret hung up and stared into the darkness of the kitchen, her reflection faint in the window. She realized then that exposing the truth was only the first fracture. What came next would be resistance. And to see this through, Margaret would have to prepare for a fight, not just against a man, but against a system that had protected him for far too long. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, reluctant disclosures, sealed files reopened, quiet phone calls made after hours. Each piece surfaced slowly, as if pulled from beneath layers of denial and institutional fatigue. Margaret learned quickly that truth, when it threatened too many people, was treated like a contaminant. The investigator assigned to the case began asking different questions. Not just what happened, but how long. Not just who, but who else knew. Margaret watched the shift happen in real time, saw the careful neutrality in professional voices tighten into something guarded. A week after the interview, Margaret was asked to come in alone. The office was small, windowless. A man sat across from her, his tie loosened, a legal pad balanced on his knee. He spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it carried weight. "We've identified concerns," he said. "Patterns." Margaret nodded. She had lived with patterns for weeks now. They no longer surprised her. "There have been previous complaints," he continued. "Nothing that rose to the level of formal charges. Concerns that were documented, addressed internally." "Addressed how?" Margaret asked. The man hesitated. "Reassigned duties. Additional supervision." Margaret let out a hollow laugh. "So you move him closer, people like my daughter." The silence that followed was answer enough. As records were reviewed, names began to surface. Women who no longer worked there, families who had quietly withdrawn from programs, notes buried under neutral language like boundary issues and miscommunication. Nothing explicit, nothing prosecutable on its own. But together, they told a story no one wanted to tell out loud. Margaret thought of all the moments she had been reassured. All the time she had been told her vigilance was unnecessary, even harmful. The system had not failed accidentally. It had chosen convenience over confrontation. The hardest part was telling Emily. They sat on the couch, the house quiet around them. There were other people, Margaret said gently, other girls he talked to. Emily's eyes widened. "Like me?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Like you." Emily absorbed this slowly, her face clouding with something that looked like relief tangled with grief. "So, I wasn't the only one." "No," Margaret replied. "And that means you were never the problem." Emily nodded, though tears slipped down her cheeks. "I thought I was bad at saying no." Margaret pulled her close. He made it hard to say no. More disclosures followed, not from Emily, but from others. A former assistant contacted investigators anonymously, then another. Their accounts mirrored the same structure: trust established, boundaries blurred, silence encouraged. The illusion cracked wider. But with every new truth came resistance. Lawyers pushed back. Statements were retracted. Timelines were questioned. Margaret watched as language shifted again, from concern to defense. "He has an exemplary record. There's no physical evidence. These are misunderstandings." Margaret wanted to scream. Instead, she documented everything. She showed up to every meeting. She repeated the facts until her voice went hoarse. At night, when the house was quiet, doubt crept in anyway, not about what happened, but about whether the truth would survive contact with power. Emily sensed it. One evening, she asked, "Are they mad at you?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Maybe." "Will they be mad at me?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "They won't get to be." Weeks turned into months. The pregnancy advanced, bringing its own physical reminders of what had been done. Emily attended appointments with new providers, each visit layered with caution and care. Then came the call. Charges were being considered, formal ones. The evidence, while imperfect, was enough to move forward. Not everything, not everyone, but enough. Margaret hung up and sat very still. She had imagined this moment, rehearsed how it would feel. Triumph, relief, vindication. Instead, what settled over her was a deep, bone-weary dread, because this was not the end. This was the point where truth stopped being private and became public, where Emily's pain would be examined, challenged, and doubted under fluorescent lights and legal language. That night, Margaret stood at Emily's doorway, watching her sleep. Her daughter's face was peaceful, unaware of the battle still ahead. Margaret whispered a promise into the darkness. I won't let them turn this into something it's not. But as she closed the door, she knew the next chapter would be the hardest of all, because the truth, no matter how carefully uncovered, would now have to survive judgment. The courtroom felt colder than Margaret expected. She sat on a hard wooden bench, hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the low murmur of voices echo off high ceilings. The room smelled faintly of paper and polish, a sterile neutrality that made everything happening there feel unreal. Across the aisle, Emily sat beside her, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. This was the place where truth was supposed to matter most. When the accused entered, Margaret felt it immediately, a shift in the air, a subtle tightening in her chest. He looked smaller than she remembered, older, ordinary. That somehow made everything worse. The proceedings began with formality and ritual. Names were read, charges stated in language stripped of emotion. Margaret gripped the edge of the bench as she listened, each word landing with clinical precision. When Emily was called to testify, time seemed to slow. They led her to the stand gently, explaining each step, each instruction. Margaret wanted to stand to follow, to shield her, but she stayed seated, nails digging into her palms. Emily spoke quietly, haltingly. Her sentences came in fragments, pauses stretching between words. The prosecutor guided her carefully, allowing space. When Emily faltered, she looked toward Margaret, searching for reassurance. Margaret met her gaze and nodded once. Then the defense began. Questions shifted in tone, sharper, more precise. They pressed on inconsistencies, on memory gaps, on Emily's understanding. Each of you sure? Felt like an accusation. Each pause, an invitation for doubt. Emily's hands trembled. I think so, she said again and again. Margaret felt her own heart fracture with every repetition. When audio clips were played, the room grew still. The voice, so calm, so practiced, filled the space. Margaret watched jurors' faces tighten, watched recognition dawn as they heard affection twisted into pressure. The defense objected. Context was questioned, interpretation challenged. Still, the words lingered. Margaret testified next. She spoke of patterns, of trust, of the moment the illusion shattered. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. She spoke not just as a mother, but as a witness to systemic failure. By the time closing arguments ended, Margaret felt hollowed out. The wait for a verdict stretched painfully long. Emily leaned against her, exhausted, eyes closed. Margaret stared straight ahead, afraid that if she looked anywhere else, she might unravel. When the jury returned, the room seemed to hold its breath. The verdict was read aloud. Not everything Margaret had hoped for, not every charge sustained, but enough. Enough to name what had happened, enough to say it mattered. Emily didn't react at first. Then she whispered, "Is it over?" Margaret swallowed. Almost. As they left the courtroom, cameras flashed briefly in the hallway. Margaret shielded Emily instinctively, her arm firm around her shoulders. Outside, the sky was overcast, heavy with unshed rain. Margaret knew this wasn't closure. The damage done couldn't be undone by a verdict, but the truth had survived judgment. And now, they would have to learn how to live with what it had cost. The world didn't change after the verdict. Margaret had expected something. Sirens, silence, relief, collapse. Instead, life resumed with a cruel normalcy. Traffic moved. Phones rang. The news cycle shifted on. The noise that had surrounded them for months faded, leaving behind a quieter, heavier aftermath. At home, the house felt unfamiliar again. Not hostile, just altered, like a place that had survived a storm but would always smell faintly of rain. Emily slept more in the weeks that followed. Some days she barely spoke. Other days she talked endlessly, replaying small moments from the past with new understanding, asking questions Margaret couldn't always answer. Why didn't it know it was bad? Emily asked one afternoon, sitting on the floor with her back against the couch. Margaret lowered herself beside her. Because he made it confusing, she said. On purpose. Emily nodded slowly. I don't like remembering. I know, Margaret replied, brushing her daughter's hair back gently. We'll remember only what we have to. They started therapy with someone new, someone patient, someone trained to listen beyond words. Progress came in uneven steps. One breakthrough followed by 2 setbacks. Margaret learned not to measure healing in milestones, but in moments. Emily sleeping through the night. Emily laughing without immediately looking afraid. Emily saying no without apology. The pregnancy brought its own reality, one Margaret had not yet fully faced. Doctors spoke carefully, options laid out with practiced neutrality. Decisions loomed, heavy and unavoidable. Margaret and Emily talked late into the night, voices low, tears frequent, choices shaped by what Emily could understand and what she wanted. Now that her wanting mattered, outside their small world, reactions varied. Some people offered sympathy. Others offered silence. A few avoided Margaret altogether, discomfort written plainly on their faces. The institution issued statements filled with distance and formality, acknowledgments without accountability. Margaret stopped expecting apologies. She focused instead on what remained within her control. One evening, while sorting through paperwork she no longer needed, Margaret came across the external drive, the one filled with evidence, messages, recordings. She held it in her hand for a long moment, feeling its weight. That drive had been their weapon, their shield, their burden. She placed it in a locked drawer and closed it gently, not because the truth needed hiding, but because it no longer needed to dominate every breath they took. Emily stood in the doorway, watching. Is it gone? She asked. No, Margaret said, but it's quiet now. They sat together on the porch as dusk settled, the air cool against their skin. For the first time in a long while, there was no appointment to rush to, no statement to prepare, no next step demanding immediate action. Just space. I don't feel broken, Emily said suddenly. Just different. Margaret smiled softly. Different isn't bad. Emily considered this. I think I'm brave. Margaret's chest tightened. You are. The road ahead was still uncertain. Trauma didn't disappear because a courtroom said its piece. Some nights Margaret still woke in panic, heart racing, convinced she'd missed something again. Some days Emily retreated into silence without warning, but they were no longer alone with it. As the sky darkened, Margaret wrapped an arm around her daughter, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. The noise, the accusations, the doubts, the judgment had passed. What remained was quieter, harder, more honest, and as they sat there together, Margaret understood something she hadn't before. Survival wasn't about returning to who they had been. It was about learning how to live, open-eyed, scarred, and still standing, after the truth had finally been heard.